So our first speaker is Dr. Matt Spangler. Matt's a professor at the University of Nebraska and no stranger to many of you. Matt's been a frequent speaker at BIF and a number of other producer workshops around the country. But Matt grew up on a diversified crop and livestock farm here in Kansas, received his degrees from K-State in 2001, Iowa State with a master's and a PhD at the University of Georgia. And again, works extensively in beef genetics extension and research at the University of Nebraska. He works as part of a team with colleagues at the University of Nebraska and the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center to improve genetic and genomic selection tools and methods, and currently leads a USDA-funded project to develop web-based decision support tools for genetic evaluation. And that's in fact what we've asked Matt to speak on today. And so with that, we'll turn to Matt for some comments on that project.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you about a project called iGenDec, which is a tool for web-based SIRE selection. I want to start by recognizing the rest of the team that's working on this. Bruce Golden from Thesis Solutions, Larry Keene, Mark Tallman, Warren Snelling, all from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, and Bob Weber from Kansas State. My goal today is to provide a bit of an update relative to where we are with the development of this web-based genetic selection tool, and along the way maybe provide a little bit of a reminder relative to the objectives and the components of selection indices and really the selection process in general. So at least as I see it, this is the situation. The global animal breeding and genetics community has done a tremendous job at increasing scientific knowledge. And that knowledge really is in terms of genetic parameter estimates, new statistical models to be used in genetic or genomic prediction. Really the whole space of genomics is part of this scientific knowledge, and then from that developing selection tools. So EPD is an example. And then I would also contend that there are certainly members of this global community which have put a great deal of effort into delivering these tools to the U.S. beef cattle industry. However, despite these advancements, technology adoption, I would contend, is embarrassingly poor, and I'd point you to survey results from Bob Weber in 2014 that indicated that less than a third of beef cattle producers utilized EPD as their primary selection criterion. Now, I understand the argument that as long as key nucleus breeders, the ones that are extremely influential within particular breeds, are utilizing the tools and doing so correctly, that those benefits trickle down, and I agree with that. And then I also understand the argument that as long as commercial producers purchased bulls from Seedstock producers that are using the tools, then perhaps the commercial producers don't need to use them as heavily. I've heard those arguments, but I would still contend that mistakes are made when we don't rely on the tools that we know work. So our thesis is that poor technology adoption is related to the sum of many underlying issues. One is that genetic prediction seems opaque. There are very few people in the U.S. beef cattle space that truly understand how we go from pedigree and phenotypes to getting EPD. And that's to be expected. I would also say that consultancy is often from sources other than what we might prefer, and that's really backed up again by survey data from Weber and others in 2014, where a lot of people receive genetics advice from people that may not necessarily be skilled in the art. Commercial producers don't have the needed time to excel in all areas and tend to focus on day-to-day animal and financial management, as I would argue they should. That's their job, and really they need to be able to rely on others to help make the genetic decision process much simpler. So combining all parcel solutions can be a very cumbersome task. It takes integrating a well-formed breeding objective with a breeding system, choosing the breeds that enter into that system, choosing what traits impact the breeding objective, and then how to objectively weight those traits. And then at the end, actually choosing the bull or bulls that match all of that. And all of this needs to contemplate economics and potential environmental constraints, which could include labor. I might say that in my mind, at least, environmental and labor constraints really manifest in economic constraints. We can change labor availability. We can change the environment. It's just often economically, it makes no sense to do so. So perhaps as a bit of background, what I'm going to share with you are the kind of status updates for a USDA-funded grant. I have here, it's a CARE grant, that's Critical Ag Research and Extension, where the aim of this project is to develop a web-based tool to aid in genetic selection decisions. The group that I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation are all part of this grant. And the project, once awarded, was initiated with an industry-wide survey in late 2018, 2019, early 2019, and I'll share some of the results of that survey with you in a few moments. And I would point out that we do have an advisory board that's comprised of producers, both commercial and Seedstock, extension faculty, and breed association staff. We've been at this project for about 2 years now, and the goal is to have this wrapped up really sometime in the next 18 months approximately. So to the survey, I'll give you a sense of the structure. It was an online survey of beef cattle producers conducted in the fall or winter of 2018 and 2019. And for what I'm going to show you today, there were approximately 1,500 respondents that were self-selected, and the survey itself was nationally publicized by beef breed associations and organizations such as NCBA, as well as various extension listservs. And these results come from just shy of 1,200 people that completed the entire survey. It was a very detailed survey, 46 questions, and I'm not going to go through that in painstaking detail and only going to highlight a little bit of it. So to start with some demographic related questions, respondents of the survey, roughly 90% of them were owners of their enterprise, with the balance principally being those that were managers but didn't have primary ownership. In terms of age of the respondents, on the x-axis or the horizontal axis here, we have year of birth. Remind you that the survey was completed in 2018 and 2019. And the average age at the time they completed the survey was somewhere in their mid-50s, and a relatively normal distribution around that. So what kind of operation did these people represent? Largely cow-calf, and the second largest response would be Seedstock, or those that had both Seedstock and a commercial cow-calf enterprise, with a relatively small contingent from other sectors of the industry. In terms of size of operation, the majority had a cow herd of between 100 and 250 cows. And if you look at this distribution, I don't think it's any surprise that there's more producers that had less than 250 cows than there are that had greater than 250 cows. Matching that, we have the number of bulls that they expected to purchase each year. And so if you think back about the number of cows they had, I think this makes sense, where most were going to purchase less than 5 bulls on an annual basis. The next few questions really get at where the respondents get information, or I suppose more specifically, what sources of information do they see as particularly valuable? So the first one is state or university extension specialists, and asking the respondents if they see that as a valuable source of information. And here you can see that roughly 55% either somewhat or strongly agree that this resource is valuable. If we look at how they feel about breed associations in terms of sources of genetic information, if we again look at the somewhat agree or strongly agree category, here it's roughly 60%, so slightly larger. And the group that at least these respondents relied on the most or saw the most value in were actually the Seedstock suppliers themselves, where roughly 80% either agree or strongly agree that Seedstock suppliers were a valuable source of genetics information. So I suspect, depending on which one of these three camps you fall into, you're either pleased with these results or a bit disappointed. My take home from this, though, is there's tremendous opportunity to ensure that Seedstock suppliers indeed feel comfortable in explaining genetic information to their clientele and have the needed tools to help their clientele through a selection decision kind of a process. And I believe, given the number of state or university extension personnel which focus in genetics, which is an extremely short list, that Seedstock suppliers do need to take on the responsibility of principally educating and aiding their clientele. What type of information did these respondents provide to use in selection, or they themselves used? It may be a bit challenging to see the labels on the vertical axis, but at the very top are raw measurements, so the actual weights, actual ultrasound data, etc. And so quite a few people rely on that. Expected progeny differences, which is third down from the top, at least for this survey, received a lot of attention, a lot of people using those. And if we look at second from the bottom, selection index values didn't receive as many votes, I guess, as what we might wish. So obviously the amount of data from which people can use to make decisions seems to be constantly growing. Selection indices meant to make that process much simpler, but at least these roughly 1,200 respondents didn't rank selection indexes as high in terms of what they either use or provide. Most of the respondents, though, consider themselves an early adopter of technology. So roughly 75% or so think that they are an early adopter of technology. Not to be too tongue-in-cheek here, but if we think back about the previous slide, selection indices have been around for a while and maybe haven't been adopted as quickly. So perhaps in terms of technology, we tend to view that a bit differently, maybe quicker to gravitate towards some types of technology and slower to others. The next couple of questions get at what these respondents plan on really focusing in terms of trait selection in the next 5 years. And here, roughly 95% thought that reproduction was either very important or extremely important going forward. And in terms of carcass emphasis, the next 5 years, roughly 70 to 75% thought it was going to be extremely important, either very important or extremely important. And so it seems like maybe a little bit more emphasis on fertility than carcass, at least for these respondents. But certainly if people thought both were important, and certainly they are to some degree, depending on the breeding objective, uh, that's a fairly extensive list of traits then which producers have to focus on simultaneously and determine how to weight them for their given goals. And that's not always easy to do, certainly not easy to do without some kind of advanced help. What kind of information do these folks use to make decisions? Well, if we think about production data, relatively good use. 70% say they have somewhat or very detailed production data that they use. And so production data I generally think of as, understanding what your pregnancy rates were, how calves performed to the point of sale, so that's weight or maybe getting carcass data back, and having that inform decisions, genetic or otherwise, on your particular operation. If we look at the level of cost data, not quite as good. If we just focus on somewhat detailed or very detailed, it's only about 55% that think they fall into that category, and that's not too surprising. Obviously, the number of producers that actually understand, or I shouldn't say understand, capture unit cost of production is relatively limited. So if we think about the use of a customizable selection tool, it seems, and not surprisingly, that more producers might be able to capitalize on being able to influence what herd level performance is for the baseline of their index, but actually taking advantage of more detailed cost information might only fit a select few. How often do they go to the internet for ag info? Important if you're going to develop a web-based selection tool, and not surprisingly, fairly frequently. Of course, this is a question that's probably biased by the nature of the survey. This was an online survey, so they had to go to the internet to get here. I find this interesting. So true or false question, and I think by our standards they answered the question, the majority answered the question correctly, but yet if you think back about what they actually use or provide to make selection decisions, most didn't rank selection indices very high, although they agree with the statement that selection indexes provide an objective and consistent weighting of EPD, enabling efficient selection among animals. So I find that a bit interesting. If an online decision support tool existed, would you use it? The majority, roughly 65%, said either probably or definitely they would. So that's certainly encouraging. And in terms of customization of a selection index, again, roughly, well, greater than 60% agree or strongly agree that they would do such a thing. Now, what does customization mean to these respondents? They may think of customization as, ad hoc-ish. I want to weight this trait 10 times more than this trait, and not thinking that customization, as we think about it, is actually helping inform the linear algebra that creates the selection index by providing detailed information about your enterprise. So let's change focus a bit and talk about really some fundamentals related to selection indices before we get into the objectives and current status of our project. Just as perhaps a reminder, selection indices are tools to enable and inform multiple trait selection. I would contend that the majority of beef cattle producers practice multiple trait selection, but the operative word here is informed, and informed in a way that the weighting of traits in that multi-trait selection decision is actually economically based. And selection indices are fundamentally based on these four things: breeding objectives. So a breeding objective really defining what traits are economically relevant to a given enterprise based on how they market calves, what the endpoints are, those sorts of things. Economic parameters, so what's the cost of particular inputs, what's the value of the saleable items, the relationships among traits, and then I have here the population or perhaps the herd level means. And by that, I mean what is the average weaning weight, the average pregnancy rate, the average cow age distribution, things of that nature. And these tools are implicitly designed to improve commercial level profitability. So let's think through the decision-making process. It all starts with developing a breeding objective, and I'm sure the audience has heard this before, but it's extremely important. As I mentioned, it identifies sources of cost and revenue and sets goals conditioned on the enterprise's resources. So this should identify things like how replacement females are going to be sourced, either from within the enterprise or externally, what the target sale point is for calves, how those animals will be marketed, and helps then identify the traits which are important to select on. Producers need to identify the breed or breeds that are going to be utilized, hopefully based on objective differences, and then develop a breeding system that combines those. The selecting seed stock suppliers or selecting bulls, you could argue what order that goes in, but the reality is that both of those need to occur, and the seed stock supplier should not only have some level of service that's agreeable to the client, but also obviously have products that match and advance the breeding objective. So this is really an abridged, probably, decision-making process, but an extremely important one to go through, and obviously a lot of layers of complexity. So perhaps to an earlier point, we have a growing amount of data. We have more and more animals entering our genetic evaluations. There's a desire to create genetic predictions for more and more traits. And we have more genotypes and more genotyped animals, and now the potential, or at least research efforts towards integration of sequence data. So a lot of data that has been successfully integrated into improved or increased knowledge. And this is where the global animal breeding and genetics community spends a great deal of time, taking data and turning the data into predictions or tools, and rightfully so. However, for the end user, the bull buyer, things have become more and more complicated. So there are a lot of bull sales and a lot of bulls in each sale, and the reality is there are just too many EPD to be able to practice multi-trait selection in any kind of informed way. So it's hard, if not impossible, to select on multiple traits at the same time using only individual EPD. And to be clear, I'm not advocating that we stop developing new EPD, particularly for traits that are economically relevant where there's gaps. Think of disease susceptibility or things related to cost of production, or maybe even indicators of those where we have no other sources of information. I think that work needs to continue. I might suggest, though, as we continue to expand the list of EPD, that we do sit back and take a reductionist approach and ask the question, are there some that we publish now that we don't need to anymore? So an example, when predictions came about for calving ease, I'm not certain why there's any, well, I know why we continue to publish birth weight EPD, but there's simply no justification for it. That's just one example. In many cases, EPD are breed specific, so we need to convert those to some kind of common base, and there are tools to do that through the crossbreed EPD adjustment factors that are made available by the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. However, those adjustment factors are updated on an annual basis only. Historically, those updates have come around the time of BIF, which of course is really in between spring and fall bull sale seasons. So admittedly not the most convenient time for those to become available. And it just adds one more step in the process that producers have to go through. If they want to compare, an example, a Charolais bull with a Hereford bull, they have to themselves apply these crossbreed EPD adjustment factors to be able to fairly compare those bulls. Producers need to account for the value of heterosis and hopefully objective differences in breeds relative to their average performance, or the breed effects. I would say that the indexes or indices that exist now and that are provided by breed associations, or here I say, and some vendors, so entities not necessarily associated with a breed association. Those tools are widely available and have been shown to be very robust and really valuable to practice multiple trait selection, but they are generalizations. So they're generalizations in the sense that they assume a common breeding objective. They're generalizations in the sense that they assume some kind of industry averages for phenotypic means, so an industry average for hot carcass weight or for pregnancy rate, etc. They're generalizations in the sense that they utilize historic average cost and revenue pricing. And none of that is necessarily bad. In fact, the latter, the averages used for pricing, end up being extremely valuable and extremely accurate in predicting the future. But I would say that there are producers that could take advantage of more refined breeding objectives, and producers that could take advantage of more refined detail in terms of their herd level means. So what we're talking about is taking tools, the increasing list of EPD, or knowledge of breed differences, or knowledge of heterotic effects, and helping people make more informed decisions, which require turning tools into impactful decisions, a place that, despite all the advances in available genetic selection technology and methods, probably hasn't received as much attention as it should. In the beef industry, we don't have a dearth at all of technology to take advantage of. We just don't seem to fully take advantage of it, and that becomes a competitive disadvantage. So we're really talking about thinking through genetic selection decisions as an investment thought process. So bull buyers are faced with the problem of obtaining the best bulls for their operation given their particular setting. And best becomes a relative concept. What may be best for me is not necessarily best for my neighbor. We may have completely different objectives. Moreover, if I'm buying bulls and the genetic value difference between two bulls is $3,000, but the better of the two sells for $5,000 more, I was better off economically to have chosen the quote-unquote worst bull of those two. And I seriously doubt the majority think through bull buying decisions like that. Now, admittedly, at auction, that becomes a challenging thing to do. But if somebody does have a better grasp of what the value differentiation is between bulls going into sales, I think they're better off. So more specifics relative to iGenDec, we've framed three what we're calling use cases. So this is how people may utilize the tool. One is commercial bull buyers, and I keep saying bull or sire, but really it's for germplasm purchase. It could be live bulls, it could be semen, it could be females. but it's commercial buyers making decisions based on firm-specific breeding objectives. It could be seedstock sellers matching their sale offering to individual customers, or seedstock buyers matching their genetic purchasing decisions to specific goals that they have as a seedstock producer. And these could be three very unique applications of iGenDec. So let's think through the components then of a customized index. So how are we actually constructing this, or how have we constructed what we've done so far? For those that understand index construction, you know that we need both genetic variances and covariances, and then also phenotypic variances and covariances. And we've obtained those from the literature. Those that have done this before know that if you obtain a lot of variances and covariances from the literature and try to put together the matrices that are required, you wind up with things that aren't positive definite. Means we can't invert them, and so we go through a process called bending, which means that we force some values to make it to where we actually can work with these matrices. So we've gone through that process. Cost and revenue pricing, as we've proposed this tool, the user could make use of industry averages, or those could be user defined. Breed information is user defined. So what's the breed composition of the cow herd? And the reason we ask that is given we take into account not only the additives, so the EPD value of the sires, but also what they bring to the mating plan in terms of heterosis. So an example, if I'm selecting bulls to be used on straight Hereford cows, all other things being equal, so EPD values being equal between a Hereford bull and an Angus bull, the Angus bull in this case has an advantage because the offspring will benefit from 100% heterosis. So that's why having some knowledge of breed composition of the cows is important. Phenotypic means, again, can use industry averages, or those can be user defined. So why is that important? So in example, if the hot carcass weights of my calves weigh are 700 pounds, and the hot carcass weights of my neighbor are 1050, there's a lot more incentive for me to increase hot carcass weight than there is for my neighbor. And so that's where herd-specific means become important. Or if I'm selling to some kind of branded beef program, and maybe the carcass specs on my calves are creating a bunch that are actually rejected for whatever reason, then there could be an advantage to me actually being able to make use of what the phenotypic means of my animals are. Breeding objectives, user defined. So I think that's really important. Again, the generalized indexes now do a good job of helping producers through the thought process of, am I completely terminal, or do I actually retain replacement females? But if I'm completely terminal, I could be selling calves at weaning, every calf at weaning. I could be retaining ownership through the feed yard and selling live. I could be retaining ownership through the feed yard, selling on a carcass basis, and then after that on a variety of different grids. So I think there are advantages in customizing the breeding objective and honing in on that a bit more. And then, of course, we need the EPD. The breeding objective helps tell us what EPDs should actually be in the index, but we actually need the EPD then to apply the index weights to. And those can be uploaded either by the potential buyer, potential seedstock sellers using the platform, or for participating organizations, so breed associations, an example, through a secure API. I might also point out that these EPDs, part of the nature of iGenDec is we want to be able to make the crossbreed EPD comparison even more seamless. And so as a consequence, if somebody wants to to look through a group of both Angus and Hereford bulls simultaneously. We can apply the crossbreed EPD adjustments behind the scenes then and make that happen. So to think through the steps for the user, they choose a use case. So one of those three cases I mentioned, are you a commercial buyer, a seedstock buyer, or seedstock seller? Use a series of drop-down menus to identify the breeding objective. Do you retain replacement females, yes or no? How do you sell your calves? So at what point, what kind of marketing strategy? Herd level parameters, so again, breed composition of females. If you want to take advantage of customizable features, you'd enter herd level phenotypic means and then maybe more detailed cost and revenue structures. But you can take advantage of a more generalized approach and use industry averages there. And then the identification of breeds, breeders, individual animals you want to apply your index to, and then come out with a ranking of candidate animals, if you will. And that's candidate animals that have an index value associated with them, where that economic selection index was generated using the information that you provided to the system. So that means that you can then compare two animals in terms of the net profit difference they hold for your enterprise based on genetic potential. Some what I call nuances. Decision support in some form or fashion, web-based or not, has been pursued before. And I might contend there are two primary reasons why those efforts either weren't successful or perhaps ran out of inertia. One is that they sometimes required a level of input from the user that just didn't match the masses. So it required input that was far too detailed. The other is there wasn't a lot of incentive, a lot of resources put into this effort. So as a consequence, if university researchers or federal researchers wanted to work in this space, there really weren't funds to enable that. If we think about the former, though, we recognize that, and so we wanted to construct something with a tiered layer of input, meaning that if somebody didn't have a lot of herd level information, they could still make use of the system and essentially create a generalized index, hopefully, though, being able to take advantage of a more specific breeding objective. And then to perhaps more, I don't want to necessarily say advanced users, but users that have more advanced levels of enterprise specific information, like maybe unit cost for production, or have a better handle on what the performance of their calves has been to date. We also take into account discounted gene flow. So if you think about a system that retains its own replacement females, the impact of a bull purchase decision obviously impacts his calf crop. But if daughters are retained, that bull purchase decision impacts his grand progeny as well. So there is impact from that decision throughout generations, but it's discounted over time as we move further and further away from him generationally. So that's discounted gene flow. We also take into account discounted expression rates. So an example, if I choose a bull and I'm choosing him based on both weaning weight and sustained cow fertility or stayability, I see the impact of that decision for weaning weight as soon as his first calf crop is weaned. I don't see or realize the impact of that decision for stayability or sustained cow fertility until his daughters go into production and perhaps reach advanced ages. So the rates at which these traits are expressed differ or can differ substantially, and that needs to be taken into account in terms of the economic values of them. Also, planning horizon. So to maybe provide an extreme example, if I'm completely terminal, my planning horizon can be relatively short. I produce a calf crop. I know all those calves are headed to market. And so as a consequence, I'm not retaining replacement females. I'm sourcing those from outside, and my planning horizon could be quite a bit shorter. However, if I retain replacement females, my planning horizon could be extended quite a bit because I'm obviously putting emphasis on traits that are not going to be expressed until much later in life. And even then, my planning horizon may be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be a 20-year planning horizon. And that changes perhaps the way I think about breeding objectives and the influence of particular traits. And planning horizon and discounted expression rates are not completely independent of each other. This tool can very much be used to create generalized indexes that are offered to the masses through breed organizations or other entities that then provide not only the generalized index, but provide users, be that members or clients, with the ability to further tweak them, if you will, based on their particular enterprise. So we see several potential uses for this. To give you a sense of the current status, we have developed what we're calling an alpha version that is currently with the grant team to work with. If you think about the development and release of software, you don't just develop something and then turn it loose and say, well, I hope we caught all the bugs before we gave it to the world. It needs to be much more methodical than that. So we have an alpha version with the grant team. The next steps are to provide a late stage alpha to our advisory board. And after they've had a chance to use it, gain some comfort with it, hopefully provide some constructive feedback to us, then we want to have some training sessions with extension personnel, breed association staff, and then hopefully migrate this into much broader use. So maybe to provide some final comments here, the impetus for this entire project is not the belief that the currently available selection indices are just so incredibly flawed they're of little value. That's quite the opposite. We wish those tools were used more frequently. But we do believe that allowing beef cattle producers to take part in the creation of their own selection index has the potential to increase the rate of adoption of these tools because they actually take part in the creation of the tool they're using and perhaps gain a better understanding of how these things come about. The other primary improvement is in the ability to combine a lot of partial solutions. So additive, so that's the EPD bit, non-additive, that's the impact of heterosis bit, combining those into really the economic weighting of selection candidates. And then enable this process to work across breeds by incorporating the crossbreed EPD adjustment component into it. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge our funding source here, and I certainly look forward to discussion.
Great, thanks, Matt. Appreciate those comments. I'm really excited about the progress our team's making on this particular project, and let's see if we've got any questions. I don't see any up yet. Get slide moved one here. Okay, we do have one from Dare says, how are you handling nonlinear traits? Matt,
yeah,
still, yeah, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So I tried to handle most of the Q&As as we went through it. So
Great,
Dare,
thanks.
I'm assuming you mean traits that may be nonlinear with respect to profit, and the reality is that that's where producer-specific means can be extremely valuable. So within a narrow range, there's linearity, but over a wide range, there can be nonlinearity. So if producers have the capability of, your example, calving ease, of telling us what their dystocia rate is, then that trait will be weighted differently for somebody that has an extreme problem. So let's say I pull 50% of my calves and you pull none, then obviously the importance of calving ease is different to us. So that becomes, I think, a valuable part of being able to establish producer-specific means. Generalized indexes can do that if they update the assumptions of the means relatively regularly as there is change in it. But still, people on the ends don't necessarily take full advantage of that.
Yeah, that's right. Great, thanks, Matt. And I know you've got somewhere to be, and in the interest of time, we'll appreciate you tallying most of the questions off in the chat as we went along. Appreciate that very much, and thanks for your comments today, Matt.
You bet. Thanks, Bob.
The state of Iowa and Iowa State University are proud to host the 2021 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Research Symposium and Convention. The convention will be located in downtown Des Moines with easy access to the airport, hotels, and local restaurants. Iowa State University is just north with its research and teaching farms. Join us in Iowa and experience how Iowa provides the beef industry with innovation to application.